Hey everyone, welcome back to True Crime for Sleep Stories. Tonight's story takes us into the quiet corners of the real world, places where ordinary moments turn dark and the truth never quite surfaces. If you're here to relax, to unwind, or maybe to fall asleep to something real but unsettling, you're in the right place. So take a moment to get comfortable. And if you've been enjoying these calm, true crime stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin tonight's case. My name is William Bill Hartley, and I was a Kentucky State Trooper for 37 years, working primarily the highways between Bowling Green and Owensboro. I started in 1972, fresh out of the academy, and the second year on the job, I encountered a case that would stay with me for the rest of my life. In October 1974, a school teacher named Evelyn Treadwell vanished on Route 231 near Hollow Creek. And despite 5 decades of questions, we never found out what happened to her. Evelyn was 33 years old in 1974, taught 4th grade at a school in Bowling Green, and by all accounts was one of those teachers students remembered fondly for the rest of their lives. Patient, creative, genuinely interested in her students, she was single, lived in a small apartment near the school, and had a close relationship with her younger sister Margaret, who lived in Owensboro with her husband and 2 small children. On Friday, October 18, 1974, Evelyn left Bowling Green around 4:30 p.m., planning to drive to Owensboro for the weekend. She told colleagues at school she was looking forward to spending time with her nieces, ages 4 and 6, and helping Margaret with some wallpapering project. It was about an 80-mile drive, mostly along Route 231, a 2-lane state highway that wound through rural Kentucky farmland and small towns. The route was straightforward and safe, not particularly busy, but well-traveled enough that if you had car trouble, someone would come along within a reasonable time. Evelyn had driven it dozens of times. Her car was a 1972 Plymouth Valiant, light blue, well-maintained. She was a careful driver, not prone to speeding or reckless behavior. When Evelyn didn't arrive in Owensboro by 7 p.m., Margaret called Evelyn's apartment, thinking maybe she'd gotten held up or decided to come Saturday morning instead. No answer. By 9 p.m., Margaret was worried and called the Kentucky State Police. I was working the night shift that Friday and took the call around 9:30 p.m., missing adult, last seen leaving Bowling Green, destination Owensboro, Route 231 likely route. At that point, it wasn't urgent. Adults are allowed to change plans, and there were dozens of innocent explanations for why Evelyn might not have arrived on schedule. But Margaret insisted something was wrong. Evelyn was reliable, she said. She wouldn't just not show up without calling. She'd been excited about the visit. This wasn't like her. I told Margaret I'd drive Route 231 from the Daviess County line toward Bowling Green, keeping an eye out for a light blue Plymouth Valiant. If I found nothing, we'd reassess in the morning. I headed south from Owensboro around 10 p.m., driving slowly, using my spotlight to scan the shoulders and any turnoffs. Route 231 had some sections where visibility was poor. Curves, hills, wooded areas where a vehicle could go off the road and not be immediately visible from the highway. Around 10:45 p.m., about 20 miles south of Owensboro, near a small community called Hollow Creek, my headlights caught something, A car parked on the shoulder just past a one-lane bridge that crossed Hollow Creek. I pulled up behind it, ran my spotlight over it. Light blue Plymouth Valiant, Kentucky plates matching the registration Margaret had given me. I felt my stomach tighten. Finding the car this quickly wasn't good. It meant something had happened, and whatever that something was, it had happened hours ago, while Evelyn was alone on this isolated stretch of road. I approached the vehicle carefully, announced myself even though the car appeared empty. The driver's door was closed but unlocked. I opened it and looked inside. The keys were still in the ignition. Evelyn's purse was on the front seat, unopened. Inside were her wallet with her driver's license, about $25 in cash, credit cards. Her overnight bag was in the back seat, neatly packed with clothes and toiletries for the weekend visit. There was no sign of Evelyn, no signs of struggle inside the vehicle, no blood, no torn fabric, no indication of violence. The car was neat, orderly, exactly as you'd expect a careful person's car to look. I radioed for backup and began examining the scene. The car was parked on the shoulder about 30 feet past the bridge, pulled over neatly as if Evelyn had deliberately stopped rather than being forced off the road or experiencing mechanical failure. The tire tracks in the soft shoulder confirmed this. She'd pulled over smoothly, not swerved or skidded. I checked the car's mechanical condition. The engine was cold. It hadn't been running for hours. I tried starting it. It turned over immediately, no problems. The gas tank was 3/4 full. There was no mechanical reason she would have stopped. I walked the area around the car and the bridge with my flashlight. Hollow Creek ran beneath the bridge, maybe 15 feet below the road level. The creek was shallow that October, just a few inches of water flowing over rocks and mud. The banks were steep and covered with vegetation. I checked the creek bed and banks for any sign of Evelyn. Footprints, clothing, anything. I found nothing. I walked the road in both directions for several hundred yards, calling out, shining my light into the woods. No response. By midnight, we had additional troopers on scene, along with deputies from the Daviess County Sheriff's Department. We conducted a more thorough search of the immediate area using more lights and more personnel. We found nothing. At first light Saturday morning, we expanded the search. Volunteers from Hollow Creek and surrounding communities joined law enforcement. We had over 100 people walking grid patterns through the woods on both sides of Route 231, searching along the creek for miles in both directions, checking abandoned buildings and barns. We found no trace of Evelyn Treadwell. The investigation shifted to understanding what had happened. Why had Evelyn stopped? The car was functioning perfectly. She had plenty of gas. The weather had been clear. There was no obvious reason to pull over. We interviewed people who lived near the bridge and people who traveled Route 231 that Friday evening. Most hadn't seen anything, but we found one witness who'd seen something significant. Clarence Bowen was a farmer who lived about a quarter mile from the bridge. He'd been driving home from town around 6 p.m. Friday evening, about the time Evelyn would have been passing through that area, and had noticed two vehicles pulled over near the Hollow Creek Bridge. One was a light-colored car, possibly blue, parked on the shoulder just past the bridge. The other was a tan sedan, darker tan, like a gold or brown, parked directly behind it. Clarence had assumed it was someone helping a stranded motorist and hadn't thought much about it. He'd driven past without stopping. He hadn't seen the drivers clearly. The angle was wrong and it was getting toward dusk, but he thought the person standing between the vehicles was male based on the build and posture. He couldn't describe the person further or provide a license plate number for the tan sedan. That sighting was crucial. It suggested Evelyn had been approached by someone in a tan sedan while she was parked at the bridge. But why had she stopped in the first place? And what had happened after Clarence drove past? We put out bulletins asking for information about tan sedans in the area, about anyone who'd seen Evelyn or her vehicle, about anyone who'd been on Route 231 that evening. We checked with body shops and mechanics, wondering if someone with front-end damage might have caused her to stop after a minor collision. Nothing came back. The investigation looked into Evelyn's personal life. Was there any reason someone might want to harm her? Any conflicts? Any romantic entanglements? Any secrets? We interviewed her family, friends, colleagues at school. Everyone described Evelyn the same way: responsible, kind, stable, content with her life. She dated occasionally but wasn't in a relationship. She had no debts, no financial problems. She got along well with colleagues and students. There was no apparent motive for anyone to target her. Her car was processed for forensic evidence. In 1974, forensic science was less advanced than today, but we checked for fingerprints, looked for any signs someone else had been in the vehicle, examined everything carefully. We found only Evelyn's fingerprints, no signs of anyone else having been inside the car. The drag marks or footprints we might have expected if Evelyn had been forcibly taken from the vehicle weren't present. The ground near where the car was parked was hard-packed dirt and gravel, not ideal for preserving prints, but there should have been some indication if there had been a struggle or if someone had been forced from the car to another vehicle. The prevailing theory became that someone had approached Evelyn while she was stopped at the bridge, had somehow convinced her to go with them voluntarily, or had used a weapon to force her to comply quietly. The person in the tan sedan had taken her somewhere, and whatever happened after that, Evelyn had never returned. But why had she stopped at the bridge initially? That remained the central mystery. The most likely explanation was that someone had flagged her down, maybe positioned themselves or their vehicle in a way that suggested they needed help, and Evelyn, being a kind person, had stopped to assist. Once she was stopped, the person had approached her, possibly with a weapon, possibly with some pretext that got her to leave her vehicle and get into theirs. Maybe they claimed there was an emergency down the road, or they needed her to drive them to get help, or they used some other ruse. The alternative, that Evelyn had stopped to meet someone she knew, seemed less likely. There was no evidence she'd been planning to meet anyone, and her sister confirmed Evelyn had no reason to stop on her way to Owensboro. The search continued for weeks. We dragged Hollow Creek and the Green River, which the creek fed into. We searched abandoned buildings, wells, any place a body might be concealed. We interviewed every registered sex offender in the region. We checked with other law enforcement agencies looking for similar cases, women who disappeared under similar circumstances. We found nothing. No body, no additional witnesses, no evidence that conclusively explained what had happened to Evelyn Treadwell. By December 1974, the active search had wound down. The case remained open as a missing person investigation, but without new leads or information, there wasn't much to actively investigate. Evelyn's family held a memorial service in early 1975, though she wasn't legally declared dead for several more years. Over the decades, the case would occasionally see renewed interest. In the 1980s, when several serial killers active in the 1970s were identified and captured, investigators compared Evelyn's case against their known victims. Ted Bundy had been in the region at various times. So had others, but none of the known killer's patterns matched Evelyn's case closely enough to make a definitive connection. In the 2000s, DNA technology advanced enough that if we'd had physical evidence, or if Evelyn's remains were ever found, we could potentially extract and test DNA. But without a body, without biological evidence from the car or scene, there was nothing to test. I retired from the Kentucky State Police in 2009 after 37 years. Evelyn's case was one of several major unsolved cases from my career, but it was the first, and it affected me differently than the others, maybe because I was young when it happened, or because I'd been the one to find her car, or because the mystery of why she'd stopped at that bridge never had a satisfactory answer. I'm 83 years old now, living in Owensboro, not far from where Margaret Treadwell, now Margaret Carson, still lives. Margaret is in her 70s, a grandmother many times over. I've stayed in touch with her over the years, checking in periodically, letting her know the case hasn't been forgotten. Margaret has lived 50 years not knowing what happened to her sister. She's told me that the not knowing is the hardest part. If Evelyn had died in a car accident, or from illness, or even in a clearly violent crime where the circumstances were understood, Margaret could have processed the grief and moved forward. But not knowing, wondering if Evelyn suffered, if she called out for help, if she's still alive somewhere, that uncertainty has shadowed Margaret's entire adult life. Over the 5 decades since Evelyn disappeared, I've developed my own theory about what happened. I believe Evelyn stopped at the Hollow Creek Bridge because someone flagged her down or staged something that looked like an emergency. The person in the tan sedan had targeted that location deliberately. It was isolated. The bridge created a natural bottleneck. Visibility from the road was limited. This person approached Evelyn with some story, maybe claiming their car had broken down, maybe saying there'd been an accident just down the road, maybe asking for directions. Evelyn, being helpful and trusting, got out of her car to assist. Once she was away from her vehicle, the person used a weapon or physical force to subdue her and force her into the tan sedan. He drove away with Evelyn, leaving her car behind, knowing it would eventually be found and would send investigators searching the immediate area while he took her miles away. What happened after that? Whether he killed her quickly or held her somewhere before killing her, where he disposed of her body, I can only speculate. The person in the tan sedan was probably someone who'd done this before or would do it again. The planning, the choice of location, the efficiency of the abduction all suggest experience, or at least careful thought. But we never connected Evelyn's case definitively to any other crime, and the person responsible was never identified. That tan sedan has haunted me for 50 years. Clarence Bowen's description was too vague. Tan or gold or brownish, 4-door, probably American-made, could have been any of dozens of common models from that era. We checked registration records, interviewed people who owned tan sedans, investigated every possible lead. But in 1974, with limited computer systems and records that weren't fully digitized, tracking every tan sedan in Kentucky was nearly impossible. Whoever drove that tan sedan probably lived a normal life afterward. Maybe they were caught for other crimes later. Maybe they continued killing, but were never connected to Evelyn's case. Maybe they died years ago, taking their secret to the grave. I'll never know. The Hollow Creek Bridge is still there, though Route 231 has been improved and widened over the years. The exact spot where Evelyn's car was found is now part of a wider shoulder, and the bridge has been replaced with a more modern structure. People drive over it every day without knowing what happened there in October 1974. But locals remember. The older residents of Hollow Creek and surrounding communities still talk about the school teacher who disappeared, about how she stopped at the bridge and vanished, about how her car was found with the keys inside and nobody ever found out why. The case remains officially open with the Kentucky State Police. Evelyn's information is in missing persons databases. If her remains are ever found, dental records and DNA from family members are available for comparison, but after 50 years, the likelihood of finding her is small. The land around Hollow Creek has been developed since 1974. Woods have been cleared for housing and agriculture. The creek itself has been modified for flood control. If Evelyn's remains were buried somewhere in that area, they might have been disturbed by construction or farming over the decades, scattered or destroyed beyond recognition. Or she might be somewhere completely different, buried in another county, in another state, in a location that has no obvious connection to Route 231 or Hollow Creek. Without knowing where the tan sedan went after the abduction, we don't know where to search. What I do know is that Evelyn Treadwell was a real person who deserved better than what happened to her. She was driving to spend a weekend with her sister and nieces. She stopped to help someone or thought she was stopping for a legitimate reason, and she paid for that kindness with her life. She should have arrived in Owensboro that Friday evening. She should have wallpapered with Margaret, played with her nieces, had a relaxing weekend, and driven home Sunday evening. She should have gone back to teaching on Monday, should have had decades more life ahead of her. Instead, she's been missing for 50 years. Her fate unknown, her family left with questions that have never been answered. I couldn't give Evelyn justice. I couldn't find her, couldn't catch whoever took her, couldn't provide her family with the closure they deserved. But I can remember her. I can tell her story. I can insist that she mattered, that her disappearance wasn't just another cold case, but a tragedy that affected real people. Evelyn Treadwell was a beloved teacher, a caring sister, a good person who stopped to help someone on a Friday evening in October 1974. She deserves to be remembered, and as long as there are people like me who worked her case and still care about it, she won't be forgotten. That's my promise to Evelyn, to Margaret, and to everyone who's been touched by this case. We won't give up. We won't forget. And if any new information ever emerges, someone will be there to follow up on it. Evelyn mattered. Her life had value, and she won't be forgotten, not as long as I'm alive to tell her story. That's the least I can offer, and I'll offer it for whatever time I have left. Rest in peace, Evelyn, wherever you are. You deserve so much better, and you're not forgotten. My name is Thomas Whitmore, and I was sheriff of Rutland County, Vermont for 28 years, from 1973 to 2001. In all those years, I dealt with the usual small-town crimes: burglaries, domestics, the occasional bar fight, hunting accidents. But in November 1978, I investigated a double homicide that remains the most puzzling case I ever worked. Roy and Helen Dobson were found dead in their farmhouse near Maple Hollow, shot with a .22 caliber rifle in a home that was locked from the inside. Despite a thorough investigation, we never charged anyone with their murders. The Dobson farmhouse sat about 4 miles outside the village of Maple Hollow, which itself was barely a village, maybe 20 houses, a general store, a church. The farmhouse was at the end of a dirt road that wound through woods and fields, isolated and quiet. Roy was 76 in 1978. Helen was 73. They'd lived there for over 50 years, raised 2 children who'd both moved away, 1 son in Burlington, 1 daughter in New Hampshire. Roy and Helen were fixtures in the area. Roy had been a dairy farmer until arthritis and age forced him to sell his herd in the early 1970s. After that, he and Helen lived quietly, keeping a large vegetable garden, some chickens, maintaining their property. They were reserved people, not particularly social, but respected in the community. On November 18, 1978, a Saturday, 2 deer hunters, brothers named Paul and Stephen Kendrick from Rutland, were tracking a wounded buck through the woods near the Dobson property. Around 11 a.m., they emerged from the tree line into the clearing where the farmhouse stood. The place looked deserted. The chicken coop door was open, chickens wandering freely. The Dobsons' truck was in the yard, covered with a few days' worth of fallen leaves. No smoke from the chimney, despite the November cold. Paul and Stephen thought maybe the Dobsons were visiting family for the holiday week, but something about the scene felt wrong to them. Paul walked up to the house and knocked on the front door. No answer. He knocked louder, called out. Still nothing. He tried the door handle. Locked. He walked around to the back door. Also locked. Through the windows, he could see into the kitchen and living room, but didn't see anything obviously wrong. But Stephen had walked around to the side of the house where the cellar doors were located. They were open, standing at about a 45-degree angle, which was unusual. Stephen called down into the cellar but got no response. The brothers discussed what to do, then decided to call the sheriff's department from the general store in Maple Hollow. I received the call around 11:30 a.m. and drove out with Deputy Frank Morrison. When we arrived, the Kendrick brothers were waiting in their truck, unwilling to enter the property further. They showed us the cellar doors and explained what they'd observed. Frank and I approached the house cautiously. Like the hunters, we found the front and back doors locked. The cellar doors were indeed standing open. I called down into the cellar. No response. Frank and I descended the stone steps into the darkness below. The cellar was typical for an old Vermont farmhouse. Stone walls, dirt floor, dark and musty, filled with stored canning jars, tools, the detritus of decades of country living. We could see daylight coming through the doorway to the kitchen at the top of a wooden staircase that led up from the cellar into the house. We climbed those stairs and entered the kitchen. That's where we found Roy Dobson. He was sitting at the kitchen table, slumped forward with his head resting on his arms as if he'd fallen asleep. There was a single teacup on the table near his right hand, still half full of tea, long gone cold. I approached and checked for a pulse. He was cold, clearly deceased, had been for some time. I could see the entry wound at the back of his head, a small hole, very little blood, consistent with a .22 caliber rifle, shot at close range. I immediately radioed for backup, the medical examiner, and the state police crime scene investigators. Frank and I proceeded carefully through the house, checking for additional victims or for the shooter. We found Helen in the living room. She was lying on the floor near the wood stove, also shot. The entry wound was in her chest, suggesting she'd been facing the shooter when she was killed. The house was otherwise undisturbed. No signs of struggle, no ransacking, no indication of robbery. The front door was locked from the inside. The deadbolt was engaged, and the chain lock was in place. The back door was similarly locked from inside. All the windows were latched from inside. The only way out of the house was through the cellar and up through those exterior cellar doors. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Chin, arrived around 1 p.m. and made preliminary examinations. Both victims had been killed by .22 caliber rifle shots. Roy had been shot once in the back of the head, execution style. Helen had been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head after she'd fallen. Time of death was estimated at 3 to 4 days prior, probably sometime between November 14th and November 16th. What struck me immediately were several details that didn't fit any narrative I could construct. First, the locked doors. If the killer had left through the cellar, why were the interior doors locked from inside? The deadbolts and chain locks couldn't be engaged from the outside. Either the killer had locked them before leaving through the cellar, or they'd been locked before the murders, and the killer had entered through the cellar. Second, the teacup. Roy had apparently been drinking tea when he was shot. The teacup was positioned near his hand, still partially full. Who sits drinking tea while being murdered? It suggested Roy had been comfortable, unsuspecting, possibly talking with someone he knew. Third, the kitchen clock. It was an old-style electric wall clock, and it had stopped at 2:47. We later determined that corresponded to 2:47 a.m., based on when the power company confirmed there had been no outages in the area. Why had the clock stopped at that time? Had it been deliberately unplugged? Had there been some electrical issue during the crime? Fourth, nothing was missing. Helen's purse contained $40. Roy's wallet had $63 in credit cards. A locked cash box in their bedroom contained about $300, their savings. Old jewelry that had belonged to Helen's mother was in a dresser drawer. The television, radio, tools, all valuable items were present and accounted for. If this was a robbery, the killer had taken nothing. The crime scene investigators processed everything thoroughly. They collected the .22 caliber bullets, fingerprinted surfaces throughout the house, documented the positions of the bodies and every detail of the scene. The bullets were sent for ballistics analysis. Standard .22 long rifle ammunition, probably fired from a rifle, though possibly from a pistol. No shell casings were found, which suggested the shooter had either used a revolver or had collected the brass. No murder weapon was found on the property. We searched the entire farmhouse, the barn, the outbuildings, the woods around the property. No .22 caliber rifle or pistol was discovered. The investigation turned to motive and suspects. The Dobson children were interviewed. Both had alibis for the estimated time of death and no apparent motive. The son in Burlington had last visited his parents 2 weeks before the murders. The daughter in New Hampshire had last visited in September. Both were shocked and grief-stricken. We interviewed neighbors, friends, people who knew the Dobsons. Everyone described them as quiet, private people who kept to themselves but were pleasant when you spoke with them. Nobody could think of any reason someone would want to harm them. Then we learned about the land dispute. The Dobson property bordered a larger parcel owned by a man named Gerald Pritchard. Pritchard was a real estate developer from Massachusetts who'd been buying up Vermont land throughout the 1970s with plans to develop vacation homes and ski condos. He'd made several offers to buy the Dobson property over the years, all of which Roy had refused. The dispute had escalated in 1977 when Pritchard began surveying land he claimed was part of his property. Roy contested the survey, arguing that Pritchard's surveyors had incorrectly placed the property line and that about 5 acres of land Pritchard was claiming actually belonged to the Dobsons. The dispute had gone to lawyers, and was still pending when Roy and Helen were murdered. Several neighbors mentioned the dispute, noting that Roy had been angry about it, felt Pritchard was trying to steal his land. One neighbor, Martha Sullivan, mentioned she'd seen Pritchard's truck on the road near the Dobson property several times in the months before the murders, though she couldn't say definitively if Pritchard had been visiting the Dobsons or just inspecting his own land. We investigated Pritchard thoroughly. He lived in Springfield, Massachusetts, but spent considerable time in Vermont managing his properties. We interviewed him at his office in Springfield. He was cooperative, expressed shock at the murders, said he and Roy had disagreed about the property line, but insisted it was just a civil matter, nothing worth killing over. We asked for his whereabouts during the estimated time of death, November 14, 16. He said he'd been in Vermont from November 13th through November 17th, staying at a cabin he owned about 20 miles from Maple Hollow. He'd been alone most of that time, working on plans for development projects. He couldn't provide alibis for specific times. Nobody had seen him during those days. We asked if he owned a .22 caliber rifle. He said yes. He owned several rifles for hunting and target shooting, including a .22. We asked to see them. He agreed and showed us 3 rifles, including a .22 caliber Ruger. We confiscated the .22 and sent it for ballistics testing. The results came back inconclusive. The bullets recovered from Roy and Helen's bodies were too damaged to make a definitive match to Pritchard's rifle. The rifling patterns were consistent with that type of weapon, but also consistent with thousands of other .22 caliber rifles. We couldn't prove the murder weapon was Pritchard's rifle, but we couldn't rule it out either. We investigated Pritchard's finances, looking for evidence of hiring someone to commit the murders. We found nothing suspicious. No large cash withdrawals, no payments to unknown individuals, no connections to anyone with criminal histories. The district attorney reviewed the evidence and concluded we didn't have enough to charge Pritchard. We had motive, the land dispute, and opportunity. He was in the area during the time of death, but we had no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene, no witnesses placing him at the Dobson property, no proof his rifle was the murder weapon. The investigation expanded to other possibilities. Had Roy and Helen been killed by someone else for different reasons? We checked Roy's background for conflicts, debts, old grudges. We found nothing significant. Roy had been a quiet man who'd lived in the same place for 50 years, farmed his land, raised his family. If he had enemies, we couldn't find them. The locked doors continued to puzzle us. The most logical explanation was that the killer had entered through the unlocked cellar doors, climbed the stairs into the kitchen, surprised Roy at the kitchen table, shot him, then shot Helen when she came to investigate. After the murders, the killer had locked the interior doors before leaving through the cellar, pulling the exterior cellar doors closed behind him. But that scenario had problems. Why lock the interior doors? It didn't serve any purpose. It actually made the crime more obvious because it created the locked room mystery that drew attention. And Roy sitting calmly drinking tea while someone entered the house through the cellar seemed unlikely unless he knew and trusted the person. The alternative was that Roy had let the killer in through the front door. They'd talked over tea in the kitchen, and at some point the conversation had turned violent. The killer shot Roy, shot Helen, then locked the doors before leaving through the cellar. That made more sense behaviorally, but raised the same question. Why lock the doors? The stopped clock at 2:47 a.m. suggested that might have been the time of death, though Dr. Chin couldn't confirm it precisely. If the murders happened at 2:47 a.m., That argued against a social visit. Nobody visits at that hour unless it's an emergency or prearranged. Maybe someone had knocked on the door late at night claiming to need help, and Roy, being a decent person, had let them in. But then why was he drinking tea? You don't make tea for a stranger who shows up at 3 a.m. claiming their car broke down. The case generated significant media attention in Vermont. A double murder in a quiet rural area was big news, and the locked door mystery made it even more compelling. The newspapers speculated about the land dispute with Pritchard, though they were careful not to directly accuse him without evidence. Pritchard eventually hired a lawyer and stopped cooperating with the investigation beyond what was legally required. The civil suit over the property line was quietly settled in early 1979. Pritchard agreed to accept the original survey and acknowledged the disputed 5 acres belonged to the Dobson estate. The Dobson children inherited the property and sold it to a family from Massachusetts who wanted a vacation home. They couldn't bear to keep it, couldn't imagine living there or visiting knowing what had happened. The investigation continued for years. I worked it actively through the early 1980s, following up on occasional tips, re-interviewing witnesses, checking on new forensic techniques that might help. In the 1990s, when DNA technology became available, we checked for any biological evidence that could be tested. There was nothing usable, no blood from the killer, no hair, no biological material we could extract DNA from. I retired as sheriff in 2001, and the case remains officially open with the Rutland County Sheriff's Department. It's reviewed periodically by cold case investigators, but without new evidence or information, there's nothing to actively pursue. I'm 86 years old now, living in Rutland still, and I've spent 46 years thinking about Roy and Helen Dobson. I've developed a theory, though I can never prove it. I believe Gerald Pritchard was involved. The land dispute gave him clear motive. He was in the area at the time. He owned the type of weapon used, and his behavior after the murders, settling the lawsuit quickly, hiring lawyers to shield himself from the investigation, all suggest guilt. I think Pritchard went to the Dobson farmhouse late on the night of November 14th or early morning of November 15th, possibly entering through the unlocked cellar doors to avoid being seen approaching the front of the house. He confronted Roy in the kitchen. Maybe Roy had gotten up for a glass of water or to check on something and found Pritchard there. They talked, perhaps argued, and at some point, Pritchard shot Roy. Helen, hearing the gunshot or sensing something wrong, came into the living room and was shot there. Pritchard then locked the interior doors, possibly to delay discovery of the bodies, possibly to create confusion about how he'd entered and exited. He left through the cellar, pulling the exterior doors closed, but not latching them securely. The clock stopping at 2:47 might have been coincidental. Old clocks fail. Or Pritchard might have deliberately unplugged it to confuse the time of death. That's my theory, but without proof, it remains just that, a theory. Pritchard died in 2003, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. If he killed Roy and Helen Dobson, he got away with it. The alternative is that someone else entirely killed them for reasons we never uncovered, and the land dispute was coincidental. That's possible, but after decades of investigating, I keep coming back to Pritchard. Roy and Helen Dobson deserved better. They were elderly people living quietly on their land, bothering no one, and they were murdered in their own home. They should have lived out their final years in peace. Their children, now elderly themselves, have lived with the lack of closure for 46 years. The son in Burlington, Roger, is in his 80s. The daughter in New Hampshire, Carol, is in her late 70s. Neither has ever fully recovered from losing their parents under such circumstances. The farmhouse still stands, though it's been renovated by subsequent owners. People still talk locally about the Dobson murders, about the locked room mystery, about whether Pritchard did it. The case has become part of Vermont lore, one of those unsolved crimes that gets discussed on cold winter nights. But Roy and Helen weren't characters in a mystery story. They were real people who lived real lives. They farmed, raised children, contributed to their community. They deserved justice, and they never got it. I couldn't give them that justice. I couldn't prove who killed them, couldn't bring anyone to trial, couldn't provide their family with definitive answers. But I can remember them. I can tell their story. I can insist that they mattered. Roy and Helen Dobson were murdered in November 1978 in their farmhouse near Maple Hollow, Vermont. Their killer was never caught, but they're not forgotten. As long as there are people like me who work their case and still care about it, they'll be remembered. That's all I can offer now. Memory, acknowledgement, and the refusal to let their deaths become just another unsolved cold case statistic. It's not justice, but it's something. And for two elderly people who were killed in their own home 46 years ago, maybe being remembered is at least a start. Roy and Helen, you deserved so much better. I'm sorry we couldn't give you justice, but you're not forgotten. You never will be. My name is Vincent Caruso, and I was a detective with the Port Authority Police Department for 32 years, working primarily out of the New York, New Jersey area, covering bridges, tunnels, airports, and transit facilities. In those 3 decades, I investigated all manner of crimes, thefts, assaults, even a few homicides. But one case stands out above all others: the unidentified woman we found in the Lincoln Tunnel in March 1981, a case that remains unsolved 43 years later. The Lincoln Tunnel connects Manhattan to Weehawken, New Jersey, running beneath the Hudson River. It's actually 3 separate tunnels: North Tube, Center Tube, South Tube, completed between 1937 and 1957. In 1981, the tunnel handled tens of thousands of vehicles daily, a critical artery for commuters and commercial traffic. The tunnels require constant maintenance. There are service alcoves, electrical rooms, ventilation systems, emergency exit passages, a whole infrastructure hidden behind the tiles and panels that drivers see. Access to these areas is restricted to maintenance workers and emergency personnel. The public never sees them. On March 23, 1981, a Monday morning around 6:30 a.m., 2 Port Authority maintenance workers, John Castellano and David Wong, were conducting a routine inspection in the South Tube. They were checking electrical systems in one of the service alcoves, accessible through a panel that opened from a narrow maintenance corridor running parallel to the tunnel. John removed the access panel and shined his flashlight into the alcove. That's when he saw her, a woman's body, positioned as if she'd been carefully placed there, lying on her back in the cramped space behind the tunnel wall. John immediately radioed Port Authority Police. I was working the day shift and responded with my partner, Detective Sarah Mitchell. We arrived at the scene around 7 a.m., and tunnel traffic in the South Tube was diverted to allow us to work safely. The maintenance corridor was narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, running along the side of the tunnel behind the tile walls drivers see. Every 100 feet or so, there were access panels that opened into small alcoves containing electrical equipment, ventilation systems, emergency supplies. The body was in one of these alcoves, a space about 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide. She was lying on her back, arms at her sides, legs straight. She appeared to be in her late 20s, Caucasian, with shoulder-length dark hair. She wore a black cocktail dress, the kind you'd wear to a club or fancy dinner, but no shoes, no jewelry, no identification. Around her neck was a length of electrical wire twisted tight. The cause of death was clearly strangulation. The position of the body and the location immediately raised questions. This wasn't a place someone could access by accident. The maintenance corridors required key card access and knowledge of tunnel systems. The public never entered these areas. Whoever had placed her body there knew about the tunnel infrastructure and had authorized access, or had followed someone who did. The medical examiner, Dr. Robert Sullivan, arrived around 8:30 a.m. He conducted a preliminary examination at the scene before the body was removed for autopsy. Based on rigor mortis and body temperature, he estimated she'd been dead for approximately 24 to 36 hours, placing time of death sometime between Saturday evening and early Sunday morning. The autopsy later that day confirmed strangulation as cause of death. The electrical wire, standard insulated copper wire used in tunnel electrical systems, had been wound around her neck multiple times and twisted tight. Death would have occurred within minutes. There were no other significant injuries, no signs of sexual assault based on the examination, though determining that conclusively after a couple of days was challenging. She had no identification on her. The cocktail dress was expensive, designer label, probably purchased at a high-end Manhattan boutique, but the label had been carefully removed, cut out with scissors or a blade. Her fingernails were manicured, suggesting she took care of herself, possibly had professional manicures. Her teeth showed good dental care, multiple fillings done by a competent dentist, but she had no fingerprints on file. We checked every database available. She'd never been arrested, never been fingerprinted for employment or security clearances, never served in the military. Her dental records were documented and distributed to dentists throughout the New York, New Jersey area and beyond, but no matches came back. The investigation focused on two critical questions. Who was she? And how did she end up behind a panel in the Lincoln Tunnel? We created composite sketches based on her appearance and circulated them to media outlets throughout the region. The sketches showed an attractive woman in her late 20s with dark hair and delicate features. We provided details about the cocktail dress, black, designer cut, size 4, hoping someone would recognize the combination of the woman's appearance and the distinctive clothing. Tips came in. People called saying the woman looked like their missing relative, or someone they'd seen at a club, or a neighbor who'd moved away. Every tip was investigated. Everyone led nowhere. Either the person they thought it was turned out to be alive and accounted for, or the description didn't actually match when examined closely. We checked missing persons reports for the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut tri-state area, looking for women in their late 20s who disappeared around the time of the murder. We found several cases, but none matched our victim when we investigated further. Either the missing women were eventually found alive, or their physical descriptions didn't align, or their dental records didn't match. The second question, how she ended up in the tunnel, led us to investigate Port Authority employees and contractors with access to maintenance areas. In 1981, there were hundreds of people with legitimate access: electricians, mechanics, engineers, cleaning crews, emergency response personnel. All carried key cards that logged their tunnel entries and exits. We pulled access logs for the weekend of March 21st, 22, looking for anyone who'd entered maintenance corridors during the time frame when the body was likely placed. Several maintenance workers had been in the tunnels on routine shifts. All were interviewed. All had alibis or explanations for their presence. None raised suspicions. But the access system had weaknesses. Key cards could be shared or stolen. Emergency exits could be propped open. Someone familiar with tunnel security could potentially enter without being logged. If the killer was an employee or former employee who knew the systems, they could have found a way in. We investigated current and former Port Authority employees, looking for anyone with histories of violence, criminal records, suspicious behavior. We found a few individuals with minor criminal pasts, DUIs, bar fights, but nothing suggesting the capacity for this kind of crime. The dress suggested the victim had been at a social event, a nightclub, restaurant, party, sometime Saturday evening. Manhattan in 1981 had a vibrant nightlife scene. Dozens of clubs, bars, restaurants where a woman in a cocktail dress wouldn't be unusual. We canvassed establishments in Manhattan, showed the composite sketches, asked if anyone had seen her. A few bartenders and doormen thought she looked vaguely familiar, but nobody could provide concrete information. Maybe she was here a few weeks ago, or she looks like someone I served drinks to once, but nothing definitive. Without knowing her identity, we couldn't trace her movements that Saturday night. The theory that developed was that the victim had been out in Manhattan Saturday evening, had been approached by someone, possibly someone she knew, possibly a stranger who'd targeted her, and had been lured or forced to accompany this person. The killer had taken her to New Jersey, possibly to the tunnel vicinity, strangled her, and then used his access or knowledge of tunnel systems to place her body in the service alcove. Why place her there? Perhaps to delay discovery. Bodies in such remote locations might not be found for weeks or months. Perhaps because the killer worked in the tunnels and felt comfortable there. Perhaps as some twisted message or signature. We couldn't determine motivation without identifying the killer. The electrical wire used to strangle her was traced to the type used throughout the tunnel system. Literally thousands of feet of this wire existed in the tunnels. It couldn't be traced to a specific location or purchase. The killer had probably taken it from tunnel supplies or brought it from elsewhere. The lack of shoes was puzzling. Had she been walking barefoot? Had her shoes been removed by the killer? Had they been expensive and the killer kept them? We never found shoes that clearly belonged to her. The investigation continued for months. We followed up on every tip, investigated every lead, interviewed hundreds of people. The Port Authority offered a reward for information. The case was featured on local news broadcasts repeatedly. Despite all this effort, we made no progress on identifying the victim or the killer. By early 1982, the active investigation had slowed. We still followed up on occasional tips and new information, but without the victim's identity or credible suspects, there wasn't much to actively investigate. She was buried in a cemetery in New Jersey in a plot donated by a Catholic charity. Her headstone read, "Unknown woman, found March 23, 1981, known to God." Over the years, the case would occasionally see renewed interest. In the 1990s, DNA technology advanced enough that we could extract DNA from tissue samples preserved from the autopsy. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS and other databases. No matches came back. Either her family had never submitted DNA for comparison, or she had no close family, or her family didn't know she was missing. In the 2000s, the case was featured on websites dedicated to unidentified victims. Her composite sketch and details were posted on the Doe Network and NamUs, National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Armchair investigators and genealogists worked on her case, trying to identify her through various methods. Despite their efforts, she remained unidentified. I retired from the Port Authority Police in 2013 after 32 years. The Lincoln Tunnel. Jane Doe was one of several major unsolved cases from my career, but she affected me differently than the others. Maybe because she was so carefully hidden, or because despite all our efforts, we never even learned her name, or because the mystery of why someone would place a body in that specific location never had a satisfying answer. I'm 77 years old now, living in New Jersey, not far from where the Lincoln Tunnel emerges in Weehawken. I still think about her regularly. The woman in the black cocktail dress, strangled and left behind a tunnel panel, whose identity remains unknown 43 years later. Over the decades, I've developed a theory. I believe the victim was involved with someone who worked for the Port Authority or a contractor with tunnel access. This person, probably a man, given the physical aspects of moving a body and the demographics of tunnel workers in 1981, was in a relationship with her, or obsessed with her, or had some connection that gave him reason to kill her. Something happened Saturday night, an argument, a rejection, a confrontation, and he killed her probably at his residence or in his vehicle. He then used his knowledge of tunnel systems to dispose of her body in a location he thought wouldn't be discovered for a long time. He removed the dress label and took her shoes and any identification to prevent her from being identified, knowing that would make connecting her death to him much more difficult. He placed her carefully in the alcove, accessed through the maintenance corridor, and returned to the tunnel to close the panel. He probably continued working at the Port Authority or left shortly after the murder for reasons unrelated to the crime. He might have been one of the people we interviewed, might have passed our scrutiny because he seemed normal and had no obvious criminal history, or he might have been someone we never identified because he'd found a way to access the tunnel without being logged. That theory has problems. It requires the victim to have had no family or friends who reported her missing, which seems unlikely for a woman in her late 20s who could afford designer clothing. It requires the killer to have hidden his connection to her well enough that we never discovered it despite extensive investigation. But it's the theory that makes the most sense given the evidence, the location of the body, the careful removal of identifying information, the use of tunnel electrical wire as the murder weapon. The alternative is that she was a random victim of opportunity, possibly a sex worker or someone living on the margins who wouldn't be reported missing, killed by someone who had tunnel access for other reasons. That's possible, but her appearance and clothing suggested someone with resources and stability, not someone living marginally. Whoever she was, whatever happened to her that March weekend in 1981, she deserved better. She deserved to live, to have a future, to be known by her real name rather than Lincoln Tunnel Jane Doe. The case remains officially open with the Port Authority Police. Her DNA profile exists in databases, waiting for a match. Her information is in missing persons systems. Periodically, investigators review the case, especially when new unidentified remains are found or new missing persons cases from the early 1980s surface. Genetic genealogy, the technique that caught the Golden State Killer, offers hope. Investigators could potentially build a family tree from her DNA, trace relatives, and finally identify her. It's painstaking work that requires resources and time, but it's possible. Several cold cases from the 1970s and 1980s have been solved this way in recent years. When that happens, if it happens, maybe we'll also identify her killer. Maybe learning who she was will lead to information about who she associated with, who might have wanted to harm her. Maybe justice, however delayed, will finally arrive. Until then, she rests in that New Jersey cemetery, her name unknown, her story unfinished. But she's not forgotten. I remember her. Other investigators who worked the case remember her. People who've read about her case care about solving it. She was real. She was a person who lived for probably 27 or 28 years, who wore cocktail dresses and had manicured nails and took care of her teeth. She went out in Manhattan on a Saturday night in March 1981, and she never came home. She deserves to be known. She deserves to have her name back. She deserves justice. I couldn't give her those things during my career. I couldn't identify her, couldn't find her killer, couldn't provide whatever family she had with answers. But I can remember her. I can tell her story. I can insist that she mattered. The woman we found behind the panel in the Lincoln Tunnel on March 23, 1981, was a real person whose life had value. She wasn't just a Jane Doe or an unsolved mystery. She was someone's daughter, possibly someone's sister or friend. She lived and breathed and had thoughts and dreams, and she won't be forgotten. Not as long as there are people who care about giving names back to the nameless and justice to the forgotten. That's my promise to her, and I'll keep it for whatever time I have left. Rest in peace, wherever you are. You deserved so much better, and someday, somehow, we'll learn your name. My name is Robert Buck Gaines, and I was sheriff of Sheridan County, Wyoming for 26 years, from 1978 to 2004. In that time, I dealt with all the usual challenges of rural law enforcement: cattle rustling, bar fights, domestic disputes, the occasional meth lab. But nothing in my career compares to the summer of 1983, when 4 people disappeared along the same stretch of highway near the Bighorn Mountains, and we never definitively solved any of the cases. Sheridan County sits in north-central Wyoming, bordered by Montana to the north and the Bighorn Mountains to the west. In 1983, the county had maybe 25,000 people spread across 2,500 square miles, ranches, small towns, vast open spaces. Highway 14 runs west from Sheridan toward the mountains, a 2-lane road that climbs through increasingly rugged terrain toward the Bighorn National Forest. It's beautiful country, but also isolated. Once you leave Sheridan heading west, there are long stretches with no services, no houses, just the highway cutting through rangeland and forest. If you break down or run into trouble, help might be a long time coming. The first disappearance was Michael Chin, 28 years old, a ranch hand who'd been working at the Circle T Ranch about 30 miles west of Sheridan. On May 14, 1983, a Saturday evening, Michael finished his shift and told his boss he was driving into Sheridan for the night, planning to have dinner, maybe go to a bar, see some friends. He left the ranch around 6 p.m. in his truck, a 1978 Ford F-150, brown and white. When Michael didn't show up for work Sunday morning, his boss figured he'd tied one on and was sleeping it off. But when he didn't appear Sunday evening or Monday morning, the boss called us. We found Michael's truck on Monday afternoon, May 16th, parked on the shoulder of Highway 14, about 15 miles west of Sheridan. The truck was locked. Keys were in the ignition. Michael's wallet was in the glove compartment with his license and about $40. There was no sign of Michael. The truck appeared mechanically sound. We had it towed and checked, and it started and ran fine. No flat tires, no engine problems, no reason Michael would have abandoned it. His belongings from the ranch, a duffel bag of clothes, his paycheck from the previous week were in the truck. We searched the area, walked the highway and the surrounding rangeland, called out his name. Nothing. We figured maybe he'd gotten a ride with someone. Maybe he'd decided to leave the area for personal reasons. We filed a missing person report and kept the case open. But without evidence of foul play, there wasn't much to actively investigate. Then 6 weeks later, it happened again. On June 28, 1983, a Tuesday, a waitress named Linda Martinez, 32 years old, left her apartment in Sheridan after her shift at the Silver Saddle Diner. She told her roommate she was driving to visit her sister in Billings, Montana, about 130 miles north. She left around 3 p.m. in her car, a 1980 Chevrolet Malibu, red. When Linda didn't arrive in Billings by evening, her sister called us Wednesday morning, worried. We found Linda's car Wednesday afternoon on Highway 14, about 12 miles west of Sheridan, just a few miles from where Michael Chen's truck had been found 6 weeks earlier. Same situation. Car parked on the shoulder, locked, keys in the ignition, Linda's purse on the passenger seat with her wallet and identification. The car ran fine, no mechanical problems, no sign of Linda. Now we had a pattern. 2 disappearances along the same stretch of Highway 14. Both vehicles found abandoned in similar circumstances. Both people vanished without a trace. This wasn't coincidence. We organized a major search operation. Deputies, volunteers, search and rescue teams combed the area along Highway 14 for miles in both directions. We checked ravines, creek beds, abandoned buildings, anywhere a person might be, injured, lost, or deceased. We found nothing. The investigation looked for connections between Michael and Linda. They'd both lived in Sheridan, but they didn't know each other. Different social circles, different work environments. The only connection was Highway 14 and the approximate location where their vehicles were found. We started patrolling that stretch of highway heavily, stopping to check on any vehicles parked on the shoulder, asking travelers if they'd seen anything suspicious. We put up signs asking people to report any unusual activity. We warned people, especially women traveling alone, to be cautious. Then in late July came the 3rd disappearance. Tom Bradley, 43, was another ranch hand, worked at a different ranch about 25 miles west of Sheridan. On July 26th, a Tuesday evening, Tom told co-workers he was driving to Sheridan to pick up some supplies and have dinner. He left around 5:30 p.m. in his truck, a 1975 Dodge pickup, green. When Tom didn't return that night and didn't show up for work Wednesday morning, his boss called us. We found his truck Thursday morning, July 28th, on Highway 14, about 10 miles west of Sheridan, the same general area where the previous 2 vehicles had been found. Same pattern. Truck parked on the shoulder. Locked, keys in the ignition, Tom's wallet in the truck. No sign of Tom. The truck ran fine. No mechanical issues. 3 disappearances in 3 months along the same 10-mile stretch of Highway 14. We had a serious problem. Either there was a predator operating on that highway, or something else was happening that we didn't understand. The FBI was contacted and agents came up from Denver to assist. We formed a task force, intensified patrols, installed temporary checkpoints on Highway 14, asking travelers if they'd seen anything unusual. We held community meetings, warned people about the disappearances, advised them to travel in groups and avoid stopping on that stretch of highway. The media coverage was intense. The disappearances made regional and even national news. 3 missing on Wyoming Highway, Bighorn Mountain mystery, highway of vanishing. Reporters came to Sheridan asking questions, filming segments, interviewing locals. Some people stopped using Highway 14 entirely, taking longer routes to avoid the area. Tourism dropped off. Ranchers started organizing convoys when they needed to drive to town. The stretch of Highway 14 between mile markers 10 and 20 west of Sheridan became known locally as the Bighorn Stretch, or the Vanishing Mile, and people were genuinely afraid of it. Then came the 4th disappearance, and everything escalated. On August 15, 1983, a Monday, a traveling salesman named David Kowalski, 51, checked out of a motel in Sheridan. He sold industrial equipment and was driving west to make sales calls in Montana. He left Sheridan around 8 a.m. in his car, a 1981 Buick LeSabre, dark blue. When David didn't check into his scheduled motel in Billings Monday night, his company tried contacting him Tuesday. When they couldn't reach him, they called us Tuesday afternoon. We found David's car Tuesday evening on Highway 14, mile marker 13, right in the middle of the stretch where the previous 3 vehicles had been found, but this time was different. The car was parked on the shoulder, but it wasn't locked. The driver's door was standing open. Inside, we found David's briefcase opened and papers scattered. His wallet was missing, and there were signs of a struggle. The interior was disheveled. The rearview mirror was knocked askew. There was a small amount of blood on the steering wheel. About 50 yards from the car, down a slight embankment, we found David's luggage. It had been opened and set on fire. Most of the contents were burned, but we recovered some metal items, belt buckles, keys, a lighter, that were identifiable as belonging to David based on descriptions from his family. This was clearly different. This was evidence of violence, of robbery, of someone deliberately destroying evidence. David Kowalski hadn't just vanished, he'd been attacked. The FBI intensified their involvement. We processed the car thoroughly, collected the blood for typing. DNA testing wasn't available yet in 1983. Documented everything. The blood type matched David's. We searched the area extensively, brought in cadaver dogs, checked every possible location where a body might be hidden. We found nothing. No body, no murder weapon, no additional evidence. The investigation now focused on finding a suspect. We interviewed truck drivers who regularly drove Highway 14. We checked for ex-convicts living in the area, anyone with histories of violence. We asked the FBI to look for similar cases in other states, patterns of disappearances along highways. A few witnesses came forward with information. A trucker said he'd seen a pickup truck, dark colored, maybe blue or black, probably a Chevy, parked near where one of the abandoned vehicles had been found. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, figured it was someone helping a stranded motorist. Another witness, a ranch wife who lived near Highway 14, mentioned she'd seen a similar dark pickup truck several times over the summer, always driving slowly along that stretch of highway as if the driver was looking for something. We put out bulletins asking for information about dark-colored pickup trucks. especially Chevys in the area. We got hundreds of tips. Dark pickups were common in Wyoming, and investigated every one that seemed credible. Then in early September 1983, we got a break. Montana State Police arrested a man named Clint Hayes in Great Falls for stealing tools from a ranch. Hayes was a drifter, 42 years old, with a criminal record including theft, assault, and drunk driving. And he drove a dark blue 1979 Chevrolet pickup. When Montana authorities ran his information and saw our bulletins about the Sheridan County disappearances, they contacted us immediately. Hayes had been in the Sheridan area during the summer of 1983. Several people had seen him. He'd worked odd jobs at ranches. He'd been living out of his truck. The FBI and I drove to Great Falls to interview Hayes. He was cooperative initially, admitted he'd been in Sheridan County that summer, said he'd driven Highway 14 many times. But when we asked about the disappearances, he lawyered up and stopped talking. We searched his truck thoroughly. We found no physical evidence connecting him to the victims. No blood, no personal items belonging to Michael, Linda, Tom, or David. But the absence of evidence wasn't exculpatory. If Hayes was careful about cleaning his truck, he could have removed any traces. We couldn't charge him. We had no physical evidence linking him to any of the crimes. We had no witnesses who'd seen him with any of the victims. We had no bodies. The most we could do was keep him on our radar and hope additional evidence surfaced. Hayes served 6 months in Montana for the tool theft, then was released in early 1984. He left Montana and we lost track of him. He surfaced occasionally over the years, arrested in Nevada in 1987 for another theft, arrested in Idaho in 1991 for assault. But we never connected him definitively to the Sheridan County disappearances. The searches for the 4 missing people continued through the fall of 1983 and into 1984. We searched hundreds of square miles of rangeland and forest. We checked abandoned mines, remote ravines, anywhere bodies might be hidden. We found nothing. By 1985, the active search operations had ended. The cases remained open as missing persons investigations, but without new information or evidence, there wasn't much to actively pursue. Over the years, the cases would occasionally see renewed attention. In the 1990s, when DNA technology became available, we tried to locate Clint Hayes to get a DNA sample for comparison against the blood found in David Kowalski's car. We finally tracked Hayes down in 1998. He was in prison in California on unrelated charges. He agreed to provide a DNA sample, probably figuring he had nothing to lose. The results came back. No match. The blood in David Kowalski's car wasn't Hayes's blood. That didn't necessarily exonerate him. It was David's blood, not the attacker's, but it meant we couldn't link Hayes to the crime scene through DNA. Hayes died in prison in California in 2004 from liver failure. If he was responsible for the Sheridan County disappearances, he took that secret to his grave. I retired as sheriff in 2004 after 26 years. The 4 disappearances from 1983 remained the most frustrating cases of my career. I'm 84 years old now, living in Sheridan still, and I think about those 4 people regularly. Michael Chin, Linda Martinez, Tom Bradley, David Kowalski. 4 people who drove west on Highway 14 in the summer of 1983 and never arrived at their destinations. 4 vehicles found abandoned on the same stretch of highway. 4 families who never got answers. Over the decades, I've developed a theory. I believe someone was deliberately hunting people along that stretch of Highway 14. The person, I believe it was Clint Hayes, though I can't prove it, would position himself on the highway, possibly creating situations that made drivers stop. Maybe he'd flag them down claiming he needed help. Maybe he'd create fake hazards on the road. Maybe he'd follow vehicles and force them to pull over. Once he had them stopped and vulnerable, he'd approach, possibly with a weapon, and would abduct them. He'd take them somewhere remote, kill them, and dispose of their bodies in locations so well hidden that decades of searching haven't found them. The Bighorn Mountains have thousands of remote canyons, abandoned mines, areas where a body could be hidden and never discovered. David Kowalski's case was different because David had fought back. The struggle in his car, the blood, the burned luggage, all suggest David had resisted, and the attacker had been more violent and desperate. That's why that scene had more evidence than the others. My theory is that after David's disappearance and the intensive law enforcement response that followed, the killer stopped. Either he left the area, which Hayes did in late summer 1983, or he was scared off by the attention and decided to lie low. That theory has problems. It requires the killer to have hidden 4 bodies so well that extensive searches never found them. It requires him to have operated for 4 months, taking one victim every few weeks without leaving clear evidence or being witnessed. It requires a level of planning and execution that seems almost implausible. But the alternative, that 4 separate incidents occurred in the same location within 4 months, all coincidentally, seems even less likely. The families of the victims have lived with the lack of closure for 41 years. Michael Chen's parents both died in the 1990s without knowing what happened to their son. Linda Martinez's sister, who I stayed in contact with for years, struggles with not knowing whether Linda suffered, where her remains are, whether she'll ever be able to properly mourn. Tom Bradley's brother has spent decades searching for information, following up on every rumor and tip, driving back roads in the Bighorns, looking for any sign of his brother. David Kowalski's wife eventually moved back east and remarried, but she's told me the uncertainty never fully healed. The stretch of Highway 14 where the vehicles were found is still called the Bighorn Stretch by some locals, and the reputation persists even though there have been no similar disappearances since 1983. People still mention avoiding it after dark, still tell stories about the 4 people who vanished. It's become part of local folklore. But Michael, Linda, Tom, and David weren't folklore. They were real people with real lives. Michael was a hard-working ranch hand, saving money to buy his own place someday. Linda was a single mother supporting 2 kids, working double shifts at the diner. Tom was a Vietnam veteran who'd found peace working with cattle. David was a dedicated salesman, a husband and father doing his job. They all deserved to come home. They deserved to live out their lives, to see their families, to have futures. Instead, they encountered something or someone on Highway 14 in the summer of 1983, and their lives ended. I couldn't give them or their families justice. I couldn't find their remains, couldn't definitively identify their killer, couldn't provide the closure they deserved. But I can remember them. I can tell their stories. I can insist that they mattered. The case remains officially open with the Sheridan County Sheriff's Department. The files are preserved, periodically reviewed. If any remains are ever found in the Bighorns or anywhere else, dental records and DNA profiles are ready for comparison. If anyone ever comes forward with information, someone will be there to investigate. That's all I can offer now. Memory, acknowledgement, and the hope that someday, somehow, the truth will surface, It's not justice, not closure, but it's something. Michael Chen, Linda Martinez, Tom Bradley, and David Kowalski were real people who mattered. They won't be forgotten, not as long as there are people who remember them and care about finding out what happened to them. That's my promise to them and their families, and I'll keep it for whatever time I have left. They deserved so much better than what they got, but they're not forgotten. They never will be. My name is Margaret Maggie Sullivan, and I was a homicide detective with the Eugene Police Department in Oregon for 29 years. In that time, I investigated over 100 murders, domestics, robberies gone wrong, drug deals turned violent. But nothing haunted me like the 3 women killed in Eugene between January and August 1987, murders the media called the Candlelight Strangler killings. The case remains unsolved 37 years later, and I've spent decades wondering if we missed something, if there was a clue we didn't see that could have stopped him. Eugene in 1987 was a city of about 105,000 people, home to the University of Oregon, known for its progressive culture and natural beauty. It was generally a safe place. Crime rates were relatively low, and most murders were domestic situations or isolated incidents. Serial killings weren't something we dealt with before. The first victim was found on January 15, 1987, a Thursday morning. Her name was Patricia Lansing, 24 years old, worked as a legal secretary at a downtown law firm. She lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in a complex on the east side of Eugene. Patricia's boss called us around 10 a.m. when she didn't show up for work and wasn't answering her phone. Patricia was reliable, always on time, and her absence without explanation was concerning. We sent officers to do a welfare check at her apartment. The apartment door was locked. Officers knocked, got no response, contacted the building manager who let them in. They found Patricia in her bedroom, lying on her back on the bed. She'd been strangled with what appeared to be a cord or rope. The ligature marks were clear on her neck. She was dressed in pajamas, suggesting she'd been killed at night or early morning. What immediately struck the responding officers was the candle. A single white candle, about 6 inches tall, was burning on the nightstand beside the bed, still lit when they entered the apartment hours after the murder. It had burned down about halfway, suggesting it had been lit for several hours. I was assigned as lead detective on the case. When I arrived at the scene around 11:30 a.m., the crime scene techs were already processing the apartment. What they found was deeply unsettling. No signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds on Patricia's body, no physical evidence beyond the ligature marks and the burning candle. The apartment door had been locked from the outside when officers arrived, not deadbolted, just the standard lock engaged. The windows were all locked from inside. Whoever killed Patricia had either been let in by her, or had a key, or had some way of entering that didn't require force. Patricia's purse and wallet were untouched. She had about $60 cash that wasn't taken. Her jewelry was in her jewelry box, including some pieces of value. The television and other electronics were present. This wasn't a robbery. The autopsy conducted later that day confirmed manual strangulation. Someone had used their hands initially, then finished with a cord or rope that we never found. Time of death was estimated between 10 p.m. Wednesday night and 2 a.m. Thursday morning. There was no evidence of sexual assault. The candle was sent to the lab for analysis. It was a standard white pillar candle, the kind you could buy at any grocery store or drugstore. No distinctive markings, no way to trace where it had been purchased. The wax and wick showed nothing unusual. We investigated Patricia's background thoroughly. She'd moved to Eugene 2 years earlier from Portland for the legal secretary job. She had a small circle of friends, mostly co-workers. She'd been casually dating, but wasn't in a serious relationship. She had no known enemies, no conflicts, no reason anyone would want to harm her. We interviewed everyone in her apartment complex, asking if they'd seen or heard anything unusual Wednesday night or early Thursday morning. Nobody reported anything. No screams, no sounds of struggle, no strangers hanging around. The complex was quiet, mostly young professionals and graduate students. The candle bothered me. Why leave a candle burning? Was it ritualistic, some symbolic meaning for the killer? Was it practical, providing light while he committed the crime? Was it a signature, a way of marking his work? I didn't know, but it felt significant. The case got extensive local media coverage. A young woman murdered in her apartment. No apparent motive, no suspects. We appealed for anyone with information to come forward. We got the usual flood of tips, most of them unhelpful, but we investigated every credible lead. By March, we'd made no significant progress. Then, on March 22nd, 1987, a Sunday evening, we got the call that changed everything. The second victim was Jennifer Marks, 26 years old, a graduate student at the University of Oregon studying environmental science. She lived alone in a studio apartment near campus. Jennifer's boyfriend had gone to her apartment Sunday evening around 6 p.m. for a planned dinner date. When she didn't answer the door and wasn't responding to his calls, he got the building manager to let him in. Jennifer was on her couch, strangled with a cord or rope, dressed in casual clothes, and on the coffee table in front of her was a single white candle, identical to the one found at Patricia Lansing's apartment, burned down about halfway, still flickering. I was called to the scene immediately. The similarities were undeniable. Young woman living alone, strangled, no signs of forced entry, no robbery, a white candle left burning. We had a serial killer. The investigation intensified. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit was contacted for profiling assistance. We formed a task force combining Eugene Police, Lane County Sheriff's Department, Oregon State Police, and FBI agents. We had to catch this person before he killed again. The second crime scene was processed as meticulously as the first. Same findings. No forced entry, apartment door locked with the standard lock when the boyfriend and manager opened it, windows locked from inside, no signs of struggle, no physical evidence beyond the ligature marks and candle. Time of death was estimated between Friday evening and Saturday afternoon. Jennifer had last been seen Friday afternoon leaving campus. She'd been dead for at least 24 hours before being discovered. We compared the two cases looking for connections. Patricia and Jennifer didn't know each other. We checked phone records, mutual friends, employment history, everything. They'd attended different high schools, different colleges, worked in different fields, lived in different neighborhoods. The only connections were that both were young women living alone in Eugene, and both had been killed by the same method with the same signature candle. The FBI profile suggested we were looking for a white male, probably in his late 20s to early 40s, someone familiar with Eugene and comfortable moving through different neighborhoods. The lack of forced entry suggested he either had legitimate access, maintenance worker, delivery person, someone residents would let in without suspicion, or he was skilled at picking locks or gaining entry through deception. The candles suggested ritualistic behavior, possibly religious or symbolic significance to the killer. The profiler said the candle might represent purification, a vigil for the dead, or some personal meaning we couldn't understand without knowing the killer's psychology. We investigated everyone with access to the apartment complexes where the victims lived: maintenance workers, managers, delivery people, utility workers. We cross-referenced employees who worked for companies that service both complexes. We found several people who might have had legitimate reasons to be at both locations, but none who raised significant suspicions. We increased patrols in neighborhoods with high concentrations of young women living alone. We held community meetings, warned women to be cautious about letting strangers into their apartments, to keep doors and windows locked, to be aware of their surroundings. We couldn't create panic, but we needed people to be vigilant. The media coverage was intense. Candlelight strangler strikes again. Eugene serial killer claims second victim. Who is the candle killer? The sensational nickname Candlelight Strangler was created by newspapers and stuck, despite our efforts to avoid sensationalizing the crimes. Spring and early summer passed with no additional murders. We hoped the killer had stopped, had left the area, had been arrested for unrelated crimes. We continued investigating, following up on tips, but the trail had gone cold. Then, on August 7th, 1987, it happened again. The third victim was Amy Rodriguez, 23 years old, worked as a bookstore clerk at a shop near campus. She lived alone in a small house she rented in South Eugene. Amy's co-worker became concerned when Amy didn't show up for her Saturday morning shift and wasn't answering calls. The co-worker went to Amy's house and found the door unlocked. Inside, Amy was in her bedroom, strangled, and on the dresser was the white candle, burned halfway down, still burning. 3 victims in 8 months, all young women living alone, all strangled, all with the signature candle, and we were no closer to catching the killer than we'd been after the first murder. The third crime scene showed the same pattern. No forced entry initially, though this time the door was found unlocked by the person who discovered the body. Time of death was estimated at late Friday night or early Saturday morning. No signs of struggle, no robbery, no sexual assault. The killer was getting in somehow, killing quickly and efficiently, lighting the candle, and leaving. The investigation was exhaustive. We interviewed hundreds of people. We checked alibis for every person who'd been mentioned in connection with any of the 3 victims. We compared the cases against known sex offenders and violent criminals in Oregon and surrounding states. We checked missing persons and unsolved homicides from other jurisdictions, looking for similar patterns. We found nothing that broke the case open. The candles were analyzed extensively. All 3 were identical, white pillar candles, 6 inches tall, standard paraffin wax, cotton wicks. The brand was determined to be a common manufacturer that distributed to stores throughout the West Coast. Thousands of these candles were sold every month. Tracing specific purchases was impossible. The lack of physical evidence was frustrating. In 1987, DNA analysis was in its infancy and not routinely used in criminal investigations. We collected what evidence we could: hair fibers, fingerprints from the apartments, but found nothing that clearly belonged to the killer. Either he was extraordinarily careful, or he wore gloves and took precautions to avoid leaving traces. The community was terrified. Women living alone took extra precautions. Many moved back with family or found roommates. Gun sales increased. Self-defense classes filled up. The University of Oregon provided additional campus security and escort services for students walking alone at night. And then, after Amy Rodriguez, in August 1987, the killings stopped. September passed. October, November, December. No additional murders with the candle signature. We maintained heightened vigilance, continued investigating, but no fourth victim appeared. By mid-1988, the active task force was scaled back. The cases remained open and actively worked, but without new murders or new evidence, there wasn't much to pursue. The media coverage faded. Life in Eugene gradually returned to normal, though the fear lingered. Over the years, theories developed about why the killings stopped. Maybe the killer had left Eugene, moved to another state, continued killing elsewhere. Maybe he'd been arrested for an unrelated crime and was in prison. Maybe he died in an accident or from illness. Maybe he'd simply stopped. Some serial killers do, for reasons we don't fully understand. We checked other jurisdictions for similar cases. Young women strangled in their homes with candles left at the scene. We found a few cases with superficial similarities, but none that matched closely enough to definitively link them. If the killer moved and continued killing, he changed his methods enough that we couldn't connect the crimes. I worked the case for the rest of my career, even as I took on other assignments. Every few months, I'd pull out the files, review the evidence, look for something we might have missed. In the 1990s, when DNA technology advanced, we retested evidence from all 3 crime scenes. We found no usable DNA from the killer. He'd been too careful, or the evidence had degraded, or it simply wasn't there to begin with. In the 2000s, the cases were featured on cold case files and other true crime programs. The publicity generated new tips, and we investigated every credible lead. DNA databases had expanded significantly, and we ran any biological evidence we had through CODIS and other systems. No matches came back. I retired from the Eugene Police Department in 2016 after 29 years. The Candlelight Strangler cases remained unsolved, the most significant failure of my career. I'm 79 years old now, living in Eugene still, and I think about Patricia, Jennifer, and Amy almost every day. Over the decades, I've developed theories about who the killer might have been. The most likely scenario, based on the evidence and the FBI profile, is that he was someone who worked in a capacity that gave him legitimate access to apartment buildings, maintenance, pest control, utility services, something that would explain why he could enter buildings without raising suspicion. He probably watched his victims for a period before attacking, learning their schedules, figuring out when they'd be alone and vulnerable. He approached their apartments using his legitimate work identity, knocked on the door, gained entry by claiming he needed to check something or fix something. Once inside, he quickly overpowered and strangled them. The candle had personal significance to him, possibly religious, possibly psychological, something that made him feel the need to leave it burning at each scene. It was his signature, his way of marking the murders as his work, even though we never publicized that detail during the investigation. After 3 murders, something changed in his life that made him stop. Maybe his work took him out of the area permanently. Maybe he was arrested for something unrelated and went to prison. Maybe he developed health problems or died. Maybe he found some other outlet for whatever drove him to kill. Or maybe he simply stopped because the fear of being caught became too great. That theory has problems. It requires the killer to have worked for a company or companies that serviced all three locations where the victims lived, and our investigation of those workers didn't produce a strong suspect. It requires him to have stopped completely after 3 murders, which is unusual for serial killers, and it doesn't explain some of the specific details. Why those 3 women? Why the specific timing of the attacks? But it's the best explanation I've developed after 37 years of thinking about it. The families of Patricia, Jennifer, and Amy have lived with the lack of closure for decades. Patricia's parents both died in the 2010s without seeing justice for their daughter. Jennifer's boyfriend, who found her body, struggled with PTSD for years. Amy's younger sister has told me she still locks every door and window in her house obsessively, still lives with the fear that whoever killed her sister could come back. The 3 women are buried in cemeteries in Eugene and nearby communities. I visit their graves occasionally, especially on the anniversaries of their deaths. I stand there and silently apologize for not catching the person who killed them, for not being able to give their families justice. The case remains officially open with the Eugene Police Department. Cold case detectives review it periodically, especially when new forensic techniques become available or when cases from other jurisdictions might be connected. The evidence is preserved, DNA profiles are in databases, and if any new information emerges, someone will investigate it. Genetic genealogy, the technique used to catch the Golden State Killer, offers some hope, but we'd need usable DNA from the killer to pursue that avenue. So far, we haven't found any that's definitively his. What I want people to understand is that Patricia Lansing, Jennifer Marks, and Amy Rodriguez were real people, not just victims in a true crime story. Patricia loved classic movies and Thai food. Jennifer was passionate about environmental conservation and wanted to work for the National Park Service. Amy wrote poetry and volunteered at an animal shelter. They had full lives, dreams, people who loved them. They deserved to live, to have futures, to grow old. Instead, they were killed by someone who targeted them for reasons we may never fully understand. Someone who left a burning candle as a signature and then vanished. I couldn't catch that person. I couldn't give Patricia, Jennifer, and Amy the justice they deserved. I couldn't provide their families with answers or closure. That failure has weighed on me for 37 years and will stay with me for whatever time I have left. But I can remember them. I can tell their stories. I can insist that they mattered, that their lives had value, that they're more than just cold case files. And I can hope that someday, maybe through new DNA technology, maybe through a deathbed confession, maybe through some piece of evidence we overlooked, the case will be solved. The Candlelight Strangler will be identified, and Patricia, Jennifer, and Amy will finally get the justice they deserved. Until that day comes, they're remembered by their families, by me, by everyone who worked their cases and cared about solving them. They won't be forgotten. Not as long as there are people who believe that every victim deserves justice, that every case matters, that every life has value. That's my promise to Patricia, Jennifer, and Amy, and I'll keep it for whatever time I have left. You deserved so much better, but you're not forgotten. You never will be. The candles may have burned out in 1987, but the memory of 3 young women whose lives were stolen burns on, and it will continue to burn until justice, however delayed, finally arrives.